In the middle of a blizzard, a quiet farmer stumbles upon a lost child in the woods, alone, freezing, and silent. He takes him in, unaware that this one act of compassion will destroy his reputation, cost him his land, and nearly shatter everything he's built. Branded a criminal by his neighbors and abandoned by a town he once called home, he prepares to lose it all until 6 military jeeps roll into his barnyard at dawn, and everything changes. What if doing the right thing made you the enemy? Stay with me. This is the story of a man who chose kindness when the world offered none. The wind had teeth that winter. It tore across the plains of rural Montana, slipping through the wooden slats of barns, howling beneath door frames, and biting into every inch of exposed skin. Snow didn't just fall here, it claimed the land, one field, one memory at a time. Mark Wilson stood alone near the edge of his wheat field, a worn fence tool in hand, coat zipped up, though it did little against the cold that had burrowed into his bones. He was 44, but looked older. Years of toil under the sun and now under the weight of grief had drawn lines across his face deeper than the seasons alone could explain. 3 winters ago, he'd buried his wife just beyond the apple tree she had planted during their first spring together. She died quickly, the kind of illness that steals breath before you even understand it's come to collect. Her absence haunted every room in the farmhouse. In the silence of early mornings, in the half-folded laundry she once took pride, in the way their son Jason sometimes stared too long at nothing. Mark was not a man who complained. He came from a line of farmers who believed in grit more than grace and in hard work more than hope. But this season had broken something in him. First, the frost arrived too soon, killing nearly half the crop before it ever stood a chance. Then the combine snapped a belt it couldn't afford to lose. Repairs drained what little savings remained. And now, letters from the bank lay stacked on the kitchen table like coiled snakes, each warning colder than the last. 14 days. That's all he had before foreclosure. Inside the house, Jason sat quietly at the kitchen table working through his homework by the dim light of a battery-powered lantern. The power had flickered out 3 nights ago. Mark hadn't told his son yet that it wasn't coming back. Jason was 10, too young to carry the weight he bore, too old to be sheltered from it. He had his mother's steady eyes and his father's stubborn silence. Together, they lived in a world shrinking by the day, a farmstead wrapped in snow and sorrow. And yet, Mark clung to it, to the land, to the house with peeling paint, to the cracked front steps he still planned to fix. Because here, memories are lived. Because here he had tried, really tried, to keep a promise-made graveside. He'll raise him right. I'll keep this place going no matter what. But promises don't pay mortgages. On that afternoon, with gray clouds rolling low and the horizon already dimming, Mark walked the fence line hoping to fix what he could before the next storm. Every wire he tightened felt like a small defiance against the inevitable. Then he saw something, a flicker of motion near the tree line, small, uneven, a figure. Mark narrowed his eyes, snow swirling thick between him and whatever was moving just beyond the edge of the forest. At first, he thought it might be a fawn, lost, out of season. But no, it staggered like a child. A long breath escaped him, steam twisting into the air. He let the tool drop from his glove and stepped forward, heart accelerating with a feeling he hadn't known in months. Alarm. Or maybe it was purpose. Branches clawed at Mark's coat as he trudged into the woods, each step crunching against ice and frozen underbrush. The air burned in his lungs, and the wind seemed to whisper warnings between the trees. But he pressed on. Here, just ahead, a small figure collapsed against the trunk of a pine, barely visible in the swirling snow. Mark quickened his pace, his boots sinking deep into the frozen mud. When he reached the child, he dropped to one knee. The boy, no older than 7, was curled into himself, shaking violently. His jeans were torn at the knees, shoes soaked through. Dirt and dried tears streaked his pale cheeks. His lips were cracked and blue. "Hey," Mark said gently, pulling off his gloves. "Can you hear me, son?" The child blinked, but didn't speak. His eyes were wide, not with recognition, but raw fear. "You're freezing." Mark peeled off his thick coat and wrapped it around the boy's trembling shoulders. "We need to get you warm. You're going to be all right. I promise." The boy didn't resist as Mark scooped him up into his arms. He was so light, too light. His skin felt like paper. As Mark carried him back toward the house, a single thought echoed in his mind. What in God's name is a child doing out here alone? By the time they reached the farmhouse, Jason had come to the door, his face twisted in confusion. "Yeah, inside," Mark ordered. "Get blankets." Jason didn't ask questions. He moved quickly, grabbing every quilt he could find. Mark laid the boy down near the wood stove, stoking it until flames roared alive again. He heated soup on the old iron burner while Jason brought dry clothes, his own pajamas, and even his favorite stuffed bear, offering it in hesitant silence. The two boys studied each other quietly across the room, as if trying to decide whether to trust one another. Eventually, Jason pushed the pajamas closer and nodded. "You can have them," he mumbled. "They're warm." Mark smiled faintly, kneeling beside the boy. "Do you have a name?" No answer, just a frightened stare. "That's okay. You don't have to talk right now." Mark tucked the blankets around him, brushing a strand of damp hair from the child's forehead. "We'll find your folks tomorrow. Right now, you rest." The boy closed his eyes, and the room fell into a deep hush, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the whimper of wind outside. Mark sat back, watching both children. Jason had curled up near the fireplace too, pretending not to watch, but clearly alert. Mark exhaled slowly, feeling something strange settle over him. Not peace, exactly, but a stillness. A moment in which the world, cruel and cold as it was, paused long enough for one act of kindness. He didn't know who the boy was. He didn't know what this would cost. But for now, he had done what needed doing. Morning came, dull and colorless. The storm had passed, but its echo lingered in the frozen silence outside. Mark woke early and stepped outside, scanning the horizon as light broke over the fields. The boy was still asleep near the fire, his breathing now steady, the feverish chill gone from his skin. By 7, Mark had called the sheriff's office. It felt late, too late, but last night the roads were barely passable and the kid been in no shape to travel. He'd made the call when it was safe, when it mattered. 2 hours later, Deputy Collins pulled into the driveway. He was young, eager, and radiated the kind of rigid authority that didn't leave room for nuance. Mark met him on the porch. "You found him yesterday evening, and you're just now reporting it?" Collins asked as he stepped inside, notebook already open. "Why the delay?" Mark gestured toward the boy, who sat curled up under blankets, still silent. "It was dark. He was hypothermic. I figured warmth and safety came before paperwork." The deputy's jaw tightened. He knelt and took a few photos of the boy with his phone. "Nah, he hasn't said a word," Mark replied. The deputy's radio crackled. "Dispatch confirms. No missing child reports match his description," a voice relayed. "Well," Collins stood, brushing off his knees, "we'll have to take him in for evaluation, and I'll need a full written statement from you this afternoon." Mark's heart sank. The boy looked up at him, wide-eyed again. Jason stood at the edge of the room, arms folded protectively. The deputy's tone was clinical and dismissive, as if this child was a problem to be processed, not a person who had nearly died in the snow. By evening, the town had already begun to whisper. Millwood was small. News traveled on the breath of porch conversations and checkout line chatter. And a story like this, a strange boy found on Mark Wilson's land, kept overnight. It did need facts to spread. Only suspicion. The hardware store, once friendly, now ran out of the pipe fittings Mark needed. At the diner, the waitress looked past him. "Sorry, we're full," she said, even though half the table sat empty. Even Jason wasn't spared. The school principal called that afternoon with a suggestion. "Until this matter is clarified," she said, voice pinched, "perhaps Jason could stay home, just for a few days." No one asked what Mark had seen. No one cared that he'd wrapped that child in his own coat and risked driving through sleet to get him food and warmth. They saw only the surface. A widowed farmer, already struggling. A boy who didn't belong. A neighbor crossed the street when Mark tried to wave. "Frank," Mark called after him, "you've known me 30 years. The man paused but didn't look back. "Maybe you should have just called it in, left it to the professionals." "Let him freeze." Mark's voice cracked. He wouldn't have survived the night. Frank said nothing. He just walked away. Inside the house, Jason sat quietly at the kitchen table, his sandwich untouched. "Why are they mad at you?" he asked softly. "You helped." Mark didn't answer. He couldn't, because deep down a part of him, one worn thin by grief, by failure, by years of holding everything together, had started to wonder the same thing. What if doing the right thing wasn't enough? The next day, the snow melted just enough to reveal the muddy truth beneath. Soggy tracks, frozen regrets, and a small town too willing to turn away. By noon, Mark heard tires crunching over gravel. He stepped out onto his porch, already bracing himself. A white sedan pulled up, spotless and deliberate. From it stepped the sheriff, stern and unreadable, and a man in a pressed black coat holding a leather folder. Someone Mark didn't recognize but didn't need to. "Banker, Mr. Wilson," the man began without greeting. "In light of recent developments and after a final review of your loan status, we're accelerating the foreclosure process. You have 72 hours to vacate the premises." Mark stared at him, stunned. "Developments?" he echoed. "You mean the child I saved from dying in your woods?" The banker didn't blink. "The situation raises concerns about your judgment and your suitability to remain within the community. It's a liability matter." "A liability?" Mark's voice rose, raw with disbelief. "You think I wanted this, that I staged it? I carried that boy through a blizzard while you were home in front of your fireplace." "That's for the authorities to determine," the banker replied coldly, then turned and walked away. The sheriff, standing beside him, avoided Mark's eyes. No one asked why he did it. No one cared. In a matter of days, he had gone from invisible to unwanted, painted a threat by rumors more convincing than the truth. That night, the farmhouse went dark. The power company cut the last connection. The warmth of the heart was gone, and the hum of the fridge was silenced. Mark and Jason packed what they could into old boxes and canvas bags. What wasn't essential, they left behind. They slept in the barn. The walls, once filled with the noise of life, radio static, frying pans, bedtime stories, had gone quiet. Even the livestock seemed to sense something was ending. Beneath the hayloft, Mark lay on a cot beside Jason, wrapped in wool blankets that smelled of earth and time. Jason turned to him, his eyes shining in the dark. "Dad, will we ever come back home?" Mark ran a hand through his son's hair. "I don't know, buddy." "But you did the right thing," Jason whispered. "You helped him. That's what you always say we should do, even when no one else does." Mark swallowed hard. His voice was barely more than breath. "It is, Jason. It's still right, even if it costs us everything, even if it costs us this." The next morning, just before the sun cracked the horizon, Mark woke to a strange sound. Not animals, not wind. Footsteps. Then silence. Then footsteps again, retreating. He rose slowly, crept to the barn door, and eased it open. There, resting on the frozen ground, was an envelope. No return address, no markings, just paper. Inside, a note in neat, deliberate handwriting. "Thank you for saving my nephew's life. We can't come forward yet, but know this, you are not alone. Help is coming." No signature, no clue who had left it. Mark read it again and again. Was it real? A cruel joke? A test? But something in the penmanship, precise, careful, didn't feel random. He tucked it into his coat pocket. Hope, once dead, stirred faintly. Not enough to rise, but enough to ache. Later that morning, as Mark and Jason loaded the last of their belongings into the rusted pickup, he noticed the curtains shifting in the houses nearby. The same neighbors who'd looked through him just days ago were watching now. Not with anger, but with something closer to shame. No one offered to help. No one apologized. But something had shifted. Jason climbed into the passenger seat, backpack in his lap, inside his bear, his sketchbook, his mother's photo. Mark took one last look at the land, at the wheat fields now sleeping under frost, at the apple tree where love still bloomed in memory, at the soil where 3 generations had left their print. "Time to go, son," he said, and turned the key. Dawn had barely kissed the horizon when Mark heard it. Not birds, not the wind. Engines. Low, steady, heavy. He stepped out of the barn, shielding his eyes as the sun crept above the trees. At first, he thought maybe the county had sent someone early, a tow truck, a sheriff's car, someone to officially mark his final eviction. But it wasn't a car. I think it was 6 of them. Camouflage-painted military jeeps roared through his gate in formation, forming a precise semicircle in front of the barnyard. Dust spiraled into the cold air behind them. Their movements were sharp and intentional, more battlefield than backroad. Each vehicle bore insignias Mark didn't recognize, no National Guard patch, no state emblem. These weren't local. He stepped instinctively in front of the barn where Jason still slept beneath thick blankets. His hands rose slowly, not in surrender, but in confusion, in defense. His heart pounded like it had the night his wife passed. Chaotic and useless. From the lead vehicle, a door swung open. A man stepped out, not bulky, but solid, tactical gear and no visible rank, but everything about his posture screamed command. His face was unreadable, stone carved by duty. He walked straight to Mark. "Mr. Wilson?" His voice was calm but edged with steel. "I'm Commander Hayes. We're here to secure your safety." Mark blinked. "My what?" Another vehicle opened. And from it. Small legs jumped down. Eli, the boy he'd found in the snow. He ran toward the barn, Jason's voice now echoing in surprise from inside. Following closely behind him was a tall man in civilian clothes, broad-shouldered, sharp-eyed, the kind of man who didn't glance around. He scanned. Mark stared. "I don't understand. What's going on?" Commander Hayes stepped closer and dropped his voice. "The child you found isn't just a missing boy. His name is Elias Thornton. His father," he nodded toward the man behind him, "is Special Agent Robert Thornton, one of our top deep cover operatives." Mark looked at the man, who nodded once, tight-lipped. Thornton spoke. "3 weeks ago, our safe house was compromised. We were being extracted under fire. Eli got separated. We believed he had been lost." The silence that followed was thick. Thornton's jaw tightened, but his voice cracked for a moment. "Until you found him." Mark's stomach twisted. "Why didn't you come for him sooner?" "Because doing so would expose everything," Hayes answered. "Your farm became a hot zone, watched by people we couldn't afford to alert. Any movement risked not just Eli, but years of infiltration, lives, whole networks." "So you let me burn?" Mark said, anger simmering. "You let me lose my home? Let the town turn on me? You watched while my son and I slept in a barn?" "No," Thornton said sharply. "We prepared. We shielded what we could. What you endured wasn't punishment. It was the cost of keeping Eli alive and our mission intact." Mark's fist clenched, jaw tight. Bitterness wanted to speak, but then he remembered the note. "Help is coming." Commander Hayes stepped aside as a female officer approached, a sealed folder in hand. "As of 600 hours this morning," she said, "your property has been designated a temporary federal safe house. All foreclosure actions have been suspended pending a national security review." Mark stared. "What does that mean?" "It means," she said, handing him the documents, "this farm is under military protection. You are no longer alone." Inside the folder were stamped papers, financial documents marked classified, and a final page. "Compensation approved, civilian action rendered in defense of national asset." Behind him, Jason emerged from the barn, rubbing his eyes. He stopped when he saw the soldiers, the jeeps, the flags. "Dad?" he asked, voice small. Eli ran to him and threw his arms around him. "You're okay," he said, his first words spoken aloud since the day he was found. Jason looked at his father. "What's happening?" Mark didn't answer at first. He just dropped to one knee, pulling both boys into his arms. The truth had found its way through the storm. By midday, Mark's kitchen, once dark and silent, was filled with a hum of power and quiet urgency. Military technicians had transformed the space into a communications hub, their presence careful but complete. Cords ran across the linoleum floor, radios buzzed and laptops glowed. The old farmhouse, built by Mark's grandfather, now served as the nerve center of a federal operation. Outside, news vans began lining the road, antennas reaching toward the sky like hungry mouths ready to devour a new narrative. Cameras pointed at the gate that just yesterday bore nothing but silence and frost. Now it bore flowers. The first bouquet arrived in the arms of a woman Mark didn't recognize, left carefully at the fence post. Then another, then folded letters in plastic sleeves, messages scrawled in apology and shame. "I'm sorry we doubted you. You did what none of us did. Thank you for saving him." By the time noon struck, A small crowd had gathered at a respectful distance. Not protesters, not gawkers, just neighbors. Watching, waiting. They didn't try to approach the house. Their presence alone spoke enough. Some stood with arms crossed, heads bowed, as if waiting to be judged. Commander Hayes called a press briefing outside the barn. Standing beneath the winter sun, he delivered a brief, direct statement to a sea of microphones. Mr. Mark Wilson, a private citizen of Millwood, Montana, rendered critical aid during an active federal security operation. His actions directly contributed to the survival of Elias Thornton, the minor son of Special Agent Robert Thornton, who remains under deep cover in a classified mission. Mr. Wilson acted with integrity, courage, and selflessness in the face of uncertainty, and at great personal cost. Footage from Mark's old security camera rolled across national broadcast within hours. There he was, grainy and hunched against the wind, carrying a limp child through the snow, his coat wrapped around small shoulders. Overnight, the story changed. By evening, the same people who had crossed streets to avoid him now left casseroles and firewood at his door. The principal called, stammering through an apology, insisting Jason was welcome back at school any time. A message was left on the answering machine from the hardware store owner. If you still need fittings, they're free of charge. But Mark didn't feel vindicated. He felt quiet. Later that night, Agent Thornton found him on the porch, watching Jason and Eli chase each other through the field. Laughter echoed across the snow-covered ground. High, breathless. My son hasn't spoken since we were attacked, Thornton said. Not a single word. Mark looked at him, uncertain. But this morning, Thornton continued, his first words were, "Is the farmer safe?" Mark's breath caught in his chest. "You carried him," Thornton said, his voice raw. "You gave him warmth, clothes, didn't ask who he was or why he didn't speak. You gave him safety when the world gave him fear." Mark shook his head slowly. "I'm not a hero. I'm just a farmer who didn't walk away." Thornton nodded. "Exactly." They sat in silence for a while, two men who had weathered different storms but found themselves on the same porch. As the last light faded from the sky, a new sign appeared at the edge of the road, just a simple wooden board nailed into the fence post. No name, no signature. It read, "Here stood a man who chose compassion over comfort and never looked back." Mark left it there. The spring arrived, like an apology, the kind that doesn't come in words but in sunlight, in thawed soil, in the first green blades poking through frostbitten earth. The wind softened, and the silence that had once haunted Mark's farm began to sound like peace. The military presence faded over time. Patrols became rare and then occasional. The hum of radio signals was replaced once again by the sound of birds returning to their nests, the creak of barn doors, and the whistle of wind in the wheat. But their brief occupation left traces, not in uniforms or fences, but in the restoration they had gifted. The barn stood straighter. The irrigation system now works. The combine purred instead of sputtered. Tools once broken now gleamed with new purpose. His loan gone, satisfied through a government agricultural development grant that came with no questions and no strings, only a quiet acknowledgement of what had been lost and what had been saved. Mark hadn't become rich. He didn't want to. What mattered now was the rhythm. Dawn chores, evening rest. The quiet companionship of boys' laughter echoed through the orchard. The way Jason and Eli ran like brothers, side by side across land that now belonged to both memory and future. Yes, Eli stayed. Legally, Mark was now his foster guardian. Informally, he was something more. Thornton still visited when security allowed. During one such visit, Mark found him by the wheat field inspecting seedlings. "Operation ends next month," Thornton said. "I've requested reassignment to a desk post. Eli needs stability and, well, I think he's found it." Mark glanced toward the porch where the two boys sat barefoot, comparing bruises and trading whispered secrets. "He'll miss you." "I hope so," Thornton said quietly, "but I was hoping he could stay here, at least part-time. He's different from you. So am I." Mark didn't answer right away. He just nodded slowly, letting the breeze carry his thoughts across the open field. That night, fireflies returned. Jason and Eli chased them through the high grass, their laughter rising and falling with the dusk like a hymn. Mark watched from the porch, boots unlaced, coffee cooling in his hand. That same porch he once stood on, alone in the cold, surrounded by suspicion and silence. Now it held life again. He didn't feel like a hero. He never had. He was just a man who refused to ignore a cry in the woods, who chose, against reason and consequence, to act with kindness. And if that made him different, then maybe it wasn't he who needed to change, but a world that had forgotten the cost of compassion. The sign at the gate still stood. Each morning, Mark passed it on his way to the fields, and each time he whispered to himself, not in pride, but in quiet promise, "And you didn't look away."